remnants of a settler society in Rhodesia, today Zimbabwe. The remnants of a settler society continue to exist, but it's very small. In Algeria, the settlers, who were French, were forced in 1962-63 to return to France. So they're examples of failed settler societies. South Africa is an interesting example, and probably unique as the example where there is most neatly a balance between indigenous society and settler society. So there are different sorts of settler societies. I want to emphasise the difference between a settler society and a colony. A colony merely has foreign rulers, whereas a settler society, people come in from outside, mostly from Europe, migrate in large numbers and establish a new society. Some of them may go there as settlers, but most Europeans who go into a colony do so as administrators or business people, always intending to return to their home society. There are a couple of examples of places where there are tiny settler societies within a colony. Kenya is a good example, where some English farmers went out and established a farming society there, and some still remain. But that's a very marginal settler society. Bit of theory. A common theory is the fragment theory. That is, that settler societies are a fragment of the colonising country. But note that settler societies are always different from their mother countries. They're always different. Even South Australia, which claimed to be a province of Great Britain, and indeed was called a province until Federation. It wasn't called a colony like New South Wales or Victoria or Queensland. It was called a province. And South Australia saw itself as a province of the United Kingdom. But settler societies are always different from their mother countries because of different migration patterns and different indigenous populations. Indigenous populations always affect settler societies in some way or another. A deal nearly always has to be cut with the indigenous populations. Indigenous culture affects settler culture. And also migration patterns. And this has been particularly true since World War II, when we've seen an acceleration in both the scale and diversity of migration around the world. So societies that were once quite similar are now quite different because of different patterns of migration. And we need only to look at Australia in that basis. But even going back much further in Australian history to the 18th and 19th centuries, to the origins of Australia as a settler society, Australia was always different from Canada or New Zealand. Australia had a higher proportion of Irish compared to those countries. Canada had a higher proportion of Scots. Canada also had an important French population. So every settler society is different because of its pattern of migration, and these affect culture. Within settler societies there are always race issues, there are always indigenous people to consider, and there is always the dispossession of those indigenous people to consider as an issue. So that's a little bit on introduction and theory. Now, I want to look at patterns of disposition. So disposition is my first thing. And in looking at dispossession, I want to look at justifications for dispossession. On what basis did various settlers justify the dispossession of native populations? And there are various ways that they did so. And let me find the first, which is a carriamento. Sometimes it was justified on a religious basis. It was justified because it was God's will, because of religious differences. The Spanish took this to a fine art.
Excuse me.
Sorry. The Spanish took this to a fine art. They produced a document called the Requerimiento in 1512, which is very early in the history of the Spanish colonisation of the Americas. In 1512, the only part of the Americas the Spaniards controlled were a few Caribbean islands. Santo Domingo was the main one. Right? The invasion of Mexico is still 7 years away. And they produced this document, a very curious document, the Requerimiento. Now, it's on the website. Let me focus it. And you can read it in full, and I haven't got time to read it in full now. But what the first page of it basically says is that the Spanish monarchs are there because God wills them to be there. And then it goes on and say, at the bottom of the page, therefore, as best we can, we ask and require that you take the time that shall be necessary to understand and deliberate upon it, and that you acknowledge the Church as the ruler and superior of the whole world, and the High Priest called Pope, and in his name the King and Queen Dona Juana are lords in his place as superiors and lords and kings of these islands, blah, 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 blah. And so it says you should convert to Catholicism and accept Spanish rule. Now, this document was read to the Indians before they attacked them in both Spanish and Latin, just to make sure they understood. And then it went on and said what will happen if they don't accept Catholicism and the rule of Spain. But if you do not do this, and wickedly and intentionally delay to do so, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall forcibly enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the Church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command, and we shall take away your goods and shall do all the harm and damage that we can. It's pretty savage, isn't it? And then here comes my favourite part of the whole thing. And my favourite part is, it's not our fault that we're going to come in and enslave you and attack you. It's your fault, right? This is what they're in it. And we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault, and not of their highnesses or ours, nor of these cavaliers come with us. Well, that's pretty savage stuff, isn't it? Having read that, you might wonder why the American Indians embraced Catholicism with such enthusiasm. When you look at the religious alternative, the traditional religions of Mexico, you might see that that may not look so tough after all, because the alternatives were a good deal tougher. I'll get onto that later on. So that's religious justification. That's the first one. The second one is purchase. And my favourite example here is Peter Minuit, the Dutchman, who bought the island of Manhattan in 1626 for 60 guilders. 24 US dollars, the greatest real estate scam of all time. To buy Manhattan for $24, I can only call it a good deal. Right? I'll take Manhattan and Staten Island too, as Cole Porter wrote in a famous song. Although why anyone would want Staten Island, I don't know. I've actually been to Staten Island and my impression of it was slags are us, but anyway. Really rough, really rough. Now, compare this with John Batman, the amazingly named Tasmanian entrepreneur John Batman, who in 1835 bought the site of Melbourne for a whole lot of trinkets from the local Aborigines. The government in Sydney said to John Batman, sorry, you can't do this, not because it's unfair to the Aborigines, but because it's not theirs to sell. Right? All land in Australia belongs to the Crown. Right? It's not theirs to sell. You can't buy from Aborigines. And another example of purchase is Thomas Stamford Raffles, who purchased Singapore in 1819 from the Sultan of Johor. At that time, Singapore was almost uninhabited. And of course, he created in Singapore a very interesting society, which I'll come on to in a little while. The third justification is simple conquest. This is a justification in international law as old as the hills. It's ours because we've won it militarily. Fourth justification, an interesting one, and this was used by Cook to justify his annexation of New South Wales in 1770. Terra nullius, no man's land. The doctrine that native people who did not cultivate land did not own it. This is a fairly subtle one, that we can take control of this land legally because the indigenous people do not cultivate it. So there was a very big difference between British justification for annexation in Australia from New Zealand or in North America. In New Zealand and in North America, there are always treaties with the locals. Right? The treaties might have been unfair,